Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into some source material you sent our way.
That's right. It's an article from Dmitrii Gorbatenko's LogBook, and the title is pretty striking. The Hollow Empire, How the U.S. Has Drifted Toward the Ghost of the Regimes It Once Opposed.
It definitely catches your attention. So our mission today, really, is to unpack the core argument in this piece.
Yeah, it's a provocative thesis. The author is basically arguing that the United States, once seen globally as this beacon of freedom, is now, in their view at least, starting to look more and more like the very authoritarian regimes it used to define itself against. Think the Soviet Union, Maoist China, even North Korea, according to the author.
Okay, so a really strong claim. Let's walk through how the author builds this case. We'll stick closely to the arguments and examples presented in the text you shared.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Well, the author begins by setting up a contrast, right, between the historical image of the U.S. and the current view presented in the article.
Exactly. They claim that for a long time, really much of the modern era, the U.S. was seen around the world as, well, a symbol, a friend, an ally, even a guardian of freedom and justice.
Yeah, the source mentions places like Eastern Europe, South America, the Middle East, East Asia. People look into the U.S. as a force for liberation, maybe a model for democracy, standing for truth, freedom, dignity. Those are the ideals mentioned.
But the author asserts that image is shattered now, totally broken in their view.
And replaced by what, according to the article?
By the image of a distant empire. An empire that once offered hope, but now, and this is a quote, wipes its boots on those who believed in it. Strong language.
Very strong. And this leads into a major theme the author identifies, which is betrayal.
Yeah, that's a central claim. The article argues the U.S. has betrayed allies, often for geopolitical reasons.
Are there specific examples given?
There are. The author points to places like Vietnam, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, arguing that, human lives were sort of toyed with and entire societies left in ruins.
The claim is that promises were made, then broken.
Right. That societies were encouraged to rise up, maybe against dictators, only to be crushed while the U.S. Looked away or walked out, as the author puts it.
And the article also claims that former friends, if they showed too much independence, were vilified.
Yes, and that loyalty wasn't met with respect, but with exploitation, using things like economic leverage, cultural pressure, military might, instead of, partnership.
Okay, so that's the external picture the author paints. But then the focus shifts inward, right, to surveillance and censorship within the U.S.?
It does, and this is where those comparisons to authoritarian states really start getting explicit.
This feels like a core part of the author's argument. They claim the U.S. surveillance state today. Well, it actually rivals what we saw in 20th century totalitarian regimes.
And that programs like the ones Edward Snowden exposed haven't shrunk, but have actually grown.
The source alleges that the government, maybe working with tech giants, collects and monitors data, and even influences public discussion on a huge scale.
An unprecedented scale is the phrase used. And they claim political dissent gets algorithmically suppressed.
Wow. And the author brings up cancel culture here, too.
Yeah.
Comparing it to, what was it?
To a digital red guard.
Yeah.
Arguing that even though it's decentralized, not direct state action, it functions similarly to punish people who step outside of what the author calls dominant ideological norms.
Okay. That's a heavy comparison. And it seems to lead into another concept the author calls the digital iron shield.
Exactly. It builds on that idea. The author argues that this digital control in the 21st century U.S. mirrors, and they even claim sometimes exceeds, the kind of control mechanisms you see in places like China.
So not an official social credit score like China's, but something that works like it in practice. How does the author say that functions?
Well, the article gives examples like someone losing their job or getting banned from online platforms or even having financial services cut off because of a tweet or a comment or supporting the wrong cause.
And the author sees companies, tech firms, banks, even schools and employers acting as the enforcers.
Yeah, enforcers of a new moral regime is the term used. A regime that, in the author's view, doesn't tolerate dissent and rewards public displays of loyalty to prevailing dogmas. It's a serious accusation about how power operates today, according to this source.
Okay. Then the article shifts again to racism and inverted oppression.
Yeah.
What's the argument there?
The author claims that, paradoxically, while the U.S. promotes anti-racism, it's adopted identity control tactics that they compare to communist societies.
How so?
The argument is that people are increasingly treated not as individuals, but primarily as members of racial or ideological groups.
Right. And the author claims that in the name of equity, some groups get demonized or blamed collectively for past wrongs.
Exactly. They draw a parallel to Mao's China, empowering certain classes while struggling against others.
So the claim is that today's America privileges some identity groups under the banner of social justice while scapegoating others for historical correction.
Yes, and the author contends this whole approach, this racialized form of political activism, hasn't healed anything, but has actually deepened divisions and reversed progress toward what they call genuine colorblind equality.
Let's talk about the media. The source uses the term controlled media ecosystem. What does the author mean by that?
They argue that legacy media outlets are no longer really acting as a check on power. Instead, they're acting more like, well, a cheerleader for establishment narrative.
They make another strong comparison here.
They do, to Pravda, the newspaper that served the Communist Party in the Soviet Union.
So the allegation is that major outlets work closely with intelligence briefings and political operatives and push dissenting voices to the margins.
That's the claim. And the author concludes pretty bluntly, when the media loses independence, democracy itself suffers.
And this connects to another point the author makes about a culture of fear and compliance.
Right. They argue that fear and conformity now go hand in hand in the U.S.
Fear of what specifically?
Fear of being, doxxed online, fired from a job, or socially ostracized. The author claims people feel pressured to conform publicly to prevailing ideological fashions or risk professional ruin.
And they single out universities.
They do, describing some as ideological re-education camps, where thought crime, the author's word, is punished socially. Again, really charged language used in the source.
Okay, let's shift to the economy. Economic injustice is the heading the author uses.
Yeah, the argument here is that the U.S. economy functions less like fair capitalism and more like a kleptocracy.
Based on what evidence, according to the author?
Well, they point to things like wealth concentration in the top 1% versus the bottom 90% unchecked corporate power, wages not keeping up for many people.
So the feeling is that the land of opportunity isn't living up to its name.
Right. The author suggests it feels more like a corporate-run feudal state for many citizens.
Now, this next comparison is, well, it's definitely provocative. The author brings up North Korea.
Yeah, they acknowledge it sounds absurd right off the bat, but they use it to make a specific point.
Which is?
The argument, believe it or not, is that even a regime as repressive as North Korea projects a sense of coherent national identity, unity, a commitment to development, however skewed.
Okay. And the contrast with the U.S. is?
That the North Korean populace, the author claims, isn't distracted by the same kind of internal identity conflicts or consumerist nihilism, that the regime, despite everything, provides some kind of collective purpose that the author feels Americans are increasingly lacking. It's a really unconventional point they're making.
Definitely unexpected. So, bringing all these different threads from the article together, what's the author's final conclusion in The Hollow Empire?
They conclude that the U.S. isn't literally North Korea or the USSR, not yet. But in what the author sees as its fear of losing control, maybe stemming from those alleged betrayals or the shattered image, it has started importing the worst habits of those regimes.
And what are those habits specifically listed by the author?
Things like bureaucratic bloat, elite control over information, what they call ideological purity tests, a form of social credit enforcement through non-state actors, and racialized policymaking.
And the author's judgment on these?
That these are not markers of a free society, plain and simple.
So the article ends with a call to action.
Yes. It says that for the U.S. to avoid becoming a parody of what it once stood for, it needs to urgently recommit to its foundational values. Liberty, transparency, free speech, decentralizing power.
And if that doesn't happen?
Then, the author warns, these comparisons, the ones that seem outrageous now, might start to feel less outrageous and more eerily appropriate.
Wow. Okay, so stepping back and looking at the source material you brought us, it really does present a very specific, very critical perspective on the current state of the U.S.
It absolutely does. And it forces you, the listener, to grapple with the author's central question. Can these efforts toward control, or toward what some see as ideological purity, inadvertently lead a society down a path toward characteristics it claims to oppose?
It certainly raises that tension between security, control, and those foundational values of a free society.
And it leaves us with a final thought to mull over based on the author's North Korea comparison, strange as it sounds.
Which is?
If a society gains control, maybe through surveillance or conformity, but in the process loses that underlying sense of shared purpose or identity, is that a trade-off worth making? Or does that loss actually undermine the society's strength in a fundamental way?
That's definitely something this author leaves you thinking about.